I always think that a great project starts off with a good plan. So because of that, I'm making templates for all of my parts. This will help me lay them out on the stock that I have, eliminating waste and getting the best grain pattern for each piece. I can rough cut the pieces at the bandsaw. This really doesn't have to be precise because I'm going to come back later after they're glued up and clean them up. As the pieces are going to be glued together to make a thicker leg, I'm planing them so they're perfectly flat. The chalk helps me know that I've hit each point on the board. And now I can glue the pieces together to support the heavy top. And then I can let them sit and dry.
1 hour later.
Once the glue is dry, I can take off all of the clamps and proceed to clean up the edge. I'm just using a hand plane for this because when I glued them up, I got them perfectly aligned. I just have to clean up the glue. And then I can use a card scraper to get closer to the final finish. A card scraper leaves a fantastic finish, but it's a little sharp to the touch, so I'm going to go over it with some sandpaper. So unfortunately the footage of me making the mortises for the legs got deleted, so I'm going to run through it right now with a piece of pine. Just know I did the same process on the walnut legs. So the first thing I did was mark out the boundaries of the mortise. I could then take a Forstner bit to gouge out most of the material to make it easier on the router. I could then take a router with an edge guide, which is just a piece of ash hot glued to the base of the router, and run it up against the edge of the board to create the mortise. I would do it on both sides of the board so that I know the mortise is centered. So with the mortise complete, I can now move on to making the tenon. I start by defining the shoulder and the cheeks on the table saw. I can then bring the tenon over to the mortise to perfectly mark out how wide it needs to be, and then cut it out. I like to use a handsaw because I can be very precise with it. To prevent chip out, I'm scoring the shoulder line with a knife. And then I can clean the tenon up with a chisel. Because the mortise was formed with a round router bit, I have to round over the tenon so it fits in well. So instead of using rebar to span the gap of the hole in the top of the slab, I'm going to try using 3.5-inch screws and screwing them partway in, and that will act as reinforcement for the concrete. I don't have any rebar, I don't know how to work with rebar, I don't have any of the metal mesh, so I think these 3.5-inch screws will be a good solution for a woodworker working with concrete. So with that jerry-rig solution completed, I can now move on to the joinery that will connect the top and the legs. I'm using a floating tenon, so I'm cutting the mortise in the top right now. With that joinery complete, I can move on to clean the slab up a little bit, sanding off the kind of fuzziness on the edges. There were some corners that I couldn't get into with the orbital sander, so I made do with a chisel and a rotary tool. Everything was going great, and right now is where the difficulties started kicking in. I'm using hot glue to attach the slab to a piece of hardboard to act as a mold for the concrete. I'm mixing the concrete up to be a little bit more soupy than what would traditionally be used because I wanted to fill all of the different crevices in the slab. And then I can pour the concrete in and vibrate the mold so that all the air bubbles come out and the concrete goes into all of the different crevices and skim the top. So the hot glue left gaps between the slab and the hardboard so concrete was able to seep in and the concrete was raised up from the slab. So I had to start over. So to prevent this from happening, I'm clamping the hardboard directly to the slab so that there will not be a gap.
Several days later.
I realized that I needed to put one of the legs in the concrete, so I knocked it out and started over again. But this time I attached the legs before I cast the concrete. So there will be 3 legs, 2 that are attached into the wood and a third that's attached into the concrete. Now to hold the leg in the concrete, I put 1¼ inch screws in the top of the leg so that it could sink into the concrete and be held rigid and strong.
2 weeks later.
And then there was a ton of sanding, but I'll save you from having to watch that.
1 eternity later.
This project had a lot of firsts for me. It was the first time that I ever worked with concrete. It was the first time that I got a wet slab and dried it myself. It was the first time that I had taken on a project which I actually didn't know how to do when I started it. My one guiding principle was to create a piece that demonstrated the interaction between man-made structures and natural beauty. The concrete lake within the natural slab really demonstrates that. To highlight that, I took this piece around to photograph different places where nature and human civilization have interacted with each other. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. Please comment, like, and subscribe.